Hello, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to episode 93 of the Simpa Life Podcast. I hope you've had a beautiful summer day wherever you have been around this wonderful little isle of ours. It's slowly coming to an end, summer. We're getting ready for winter, and I just kind of thought we needed a guest that would be appropriate for this. So as you're probably seeing at the minute, there is a hell of a lot of prevalence and discussion and topic, especially in our culture and within now the mainstream legacy media, around the potential benefits, especially the antidepressive and anxiolytic benefits of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. So I thought I'd dig into my little address book and the people that I know and find a guest that would be appropriate for you. So I don't know how, but today's guest I managed to pull together. I'm amazed as well, as much as you are, as soon as you've seen his name fly up in the bio there. So yeah, without further ado, I'll introduce them because there is so much subject matter to cover here. Today's guest is an American, immediately with a big word, ethnopharmacologist, research pharmacologist, a highly respected lecturer, prolific author, public speaker, and a founding member of the Heffter Research Institute, and director and president of the McKenna Academy. They are the legendary Dennis Mckenna. How are you doing, brother?
Very well. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Me too, brother. Me too. Honestly, I've gone down my own little rabbit holes, as many of us do with psychedelics in terms of experience. And one of these experiences led me to research, to actually go, well, now I'm going to integrate this and understand this. And it was yourself and your brother's work that I first stumbled across before I even realized that, wait a minute, academics, the smart people did these drugs. It's not just me in the woods with a couple of mates around a fire. Intellectuals did this, and it really kickstarted this idea in me that, wait a minute, there's the way we perceive drugs, and there's then what drugs are and what drugs can be and what drugs have been. So yeah, you were literally the top of my list when it came to this subject matter. So again, yeah, thank you very much for making the time.
Happy to be here. Let's delve into it.
Excellent. Well, I suppose there's going to be, my podcast is predominantly around UK and European cannabis culture. There are obviously going to be some people listening to this that maybe don't know yourself or Terence, which I think is an intellectual and personal tragedy at this point. But hey ho, let's hope to enlighten them with this conversation. So could you sort of give us a brief synopsis? I know that's a very difficult thing to say to someone like yourself, but a brief synopsis of sort of your work and how you've kind of ended up in this field.
Well, both my brother and I, of course, go way back. I'm a geezer. I'm an old guy. I've been in this since the mid '60s when I was a teenager, and we both grew up in those turbulent times, and we're excited about psychedelics, and really the Timothy Leary was kind of the cultural icon of psychedelics at the time, and that was his message. But we were both Terence and I were a little bit put off by that, and we kind of realized that there has to be more to it than that, what he was talking about. So we got into the ethnographic side of it, and in my particular case, I was attracted to the chemistry, the pharmacology of these plants, and my brother was more the philosopher and the metaphysician side of the team. And between the two of us, we had all those bases covered. So just psychedelics have been one of the most interesting aspects of my life ever since I was a teenager, and I pursued the investigation both officially and unofficially, like yourself. I think a lot of people have been profoundly influenced by their own personal experiences, and then the question is, what do you do with those experiences? How does that influence your life? And in my case, a couple of major influences. I was a science geek, as a teenager, and so was my brother. And a couple of books came onto my radar at the age of 18. One of them was The Teachings of Don Juan, which everyone knows about, probably Carlos Castaneda's stories of his apprenticeship with the Yaqui shaman, and Don Juan was the Yaqui shaman's name. Supposedly, a lot of Castaneda's work is, shall we say, highly exaggerated, if not fictitious. But it doesn't really matter, because for me, it revealed that there is an ethnographic side, that these things are not new. They didn't start with Timothy Leary. They didn't even start with Albert Hoffman. These substances are thousands of years old, and they have thousands of year old traditions of use, in ethnomedicine and shamanism and so on. So that was one big influence. That book my brother gave to me for my 18th birthday, the first edition of the Teachings of Don Juan. But later that year, in my 18th year, another book came onto my radar, and I'm not sure how it happened, but a book called The Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And this was the record of a symposium that was sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health in San Francisco in 1967. And it brought together all the leading researchers in the field to this private conference in San Francisco. All the leading researchers. There weren't that many people specializing in this really obscure area, at that time, but it brought them all together. And so Richard Schultes, Andrew Weil, Alexander Shulgin, people and others, those names are known to many people. But this symposium, the only thing that taxpayer ever got out of it was the book that was published from it. And that book came onto my radar, as I say, at the age of 18. And that for me was the other side of the coin. I realized there is science behind this. There's actually a discipline behind the study of these things as they're used in traditional cultures, ethnopharmacology. So I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to be an ethnopharmacologist. And that kind of set the trajectory of my career. And I set out to study, that field, which is inherently interdisciplinary. So my degrees, my PhD, my master's degree are in botany, but they're really ethnopharmacology, the interdisciplinary study of the use of plants, not just for psychoactive purposes, but all sorts of purposes. And then, interestingly, in more recent years, that book was always very important to me. And when the government put that conference on, there were supposed to be follow-up conferences, but the war on drugs intervened, and they never did follow up with any conferences. The whole thing became stigmatized. I think the government became embarrassed that they never, had anything to do with it. But I thought it was a landmark, publication, and it was. So in 2017, I decided to organize a 50th anniversary symposium in honor of the first one. So we called it ESPD 50, and for Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And we put that on in the UK in 2017. And then actually just this last May, we decided to do another one. So we did ESPD 55 just this last May, the 55th anniversary of the first one. So both those things are still out there. If you I'll just put them in the chat here. I guess I don't really need to, but ESPD50.com is still there, and ESPD55.com. And you can actually get to ESPD 50 from ESPD 55 as well. And the latest conference was many more speakers, very broad range of topics. So people can go to that site, and it was all live streamed and recorded. So at the live stream, it was watched by several hundred, well, no, several tens of thousands of people in both conferences, and but the recordings are all there, so people can sign on to ESPD 55, and you can register with your email and password. There's no charge for it. It's open access. Excellent. And just go through the program and watch what you want. There's some wonderful presentations there. So I'm kind of, by bringing these conferences forward, I'm sort of paying it forward or paying it back in a certain way. ESPD number one in ESPD 50 in 2017, we published not only the proceedings of the 2017 conference, but we republished the 1967 conference as well in a box set, in a beautiful collector's edition box set, which people can still order. So we brought the 1967 conference back to life as well. And even though it was 50 years ago, there's some pretty interesting stuff in that too. So it gives you a snapshot of the field 50 years ago in 1967 and now today. So that's out there, and that's that's relatively recent. So if people want to follow this up, those are the two key websites to look at.
Fascinating, really fascinating. It's brilliant that they're open access as well. And I think being able to correlate and kind of juxtapose what we've learned, or in a lot of ways, I guess, what we've had to relearn in the 50 years since the first conference, and then the anniversary, and obviously this one subsequently since. You spoke of, obviously, I suppose, we all know the feeling. I kind of actually, my older sibling didn't really get me in that much trouble, although she did introduce me to a lot of music. That scene probably got me into a lot of trouble. So obviously you spoke of sort of Terence handing down sort of this literature and his kind of, I guess, kind of his worldview, and together you kind of, as you moved into adulthood, kind of made this partnership in this team. Obviously, you quite juxtaposed, as you spoke of, in terms of Terence, very philosophic, and you were in quite a nascent area of research that a lot of people, as you say, were still very quite judgmental of. There was obviously the ramping up of the war on drugs, so there wasn't just necessarily the full moralizing and religious hysteria of, oh, you can't see God, that's what the people in the church are for, sort of hysteria. How did then there be such a divergence, yet you worked together so intimately for so long, yet you were able to, I suppose, as that team, cover the full spectrum? You could speak in the academic realms, and then Terence could sit, barefoot in a lotus position, sort of evangelicalizing about the potential benefits of this, and discussing, entities and others and all of these things that are, not quantifiable in current scientific literature, really.
Well, right. Yeah, it wasn't a strict division of labor. It wasn't like, okay, I'm the chemist and the pharmacologist and the botanist, you're the philosopher, and you don't tread on me, kind of thing. I mean, we obviously, these things are fascinating because of the states of mind that they induce, and they are getting a lot of attention now for their potential for therapy, for anxiety, as you mentioned, PTSD, end of life, people in end of life conditions who are anxious about death. They help people come to terms with that. There's just been a landmark study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association just last week, the culmination of several years of work by an investigator named Michael Bogenschutz to treat, using psilocybin to treat alcohol, what they now call alcohol use disorder. Well, they were using LSD back in the 60s in a very similar way, and they were getting good results. from, particularly Humphrey Osmond's work in Saskatchewan in the 60s, using LSD to treat alcoholism. But the political forces were so busy trying to suppress and prohibit these drugs that, nobody noticed that they were getting good results. Well, 50 years or however long it's been since, the whole conversation has changed, and now we know, because of the research that's been done, because there's good science behind the research now, that the public conversation has really shifted toward the benefits of these compounds. So alcoholism is one. The results from that was incredible results. 83% of the subjects, long-time serious alcoholics, unable to control their use of alcohol, and all the consequences that came from that, were able to basically drop it, and persist. It lasted, the persistent effects, months and years. So this study was just published. There's been a previous a previous investigator from the Johns Hopkins group using psilocybin for smoking cessation, and again with spectacular results. Long-term, 3-pack a day, serious addicts. I hope you're not one of those. But
not anymore.
But people that just have a very hard time, with quitting. And I'm a former smoker. I know how hard it is. And in this study, they were again able to, 86% of the people, after 2 or 3 fairly high dose psilocybin sessions with the supporting therapy and all that, were able to quit smoking and stick to it, and just not take it up. So I think that's interesting that, if you look at the medical landscape at the moment, that what are the 3 main factors that are the most serious public health threats, right? In a certain way. And alcohol misuse, alcohol use disorder, as they call it, and smoking are the 2 main ones in terms of their impact on the medical system, the cost to the medical system, and impact on people's lives. And psilocybin appears to be a treatment for these that just blows away everything else, and that's, so hopefully we'll see these things fast track. Obviously, these are not substances that this is never take 2 and call me in the morning. It doesn't work that way. You have to do intense therapy, leading up to it and during the session and after the session, to help people interpret and integrate what they learn. But with that kind of therapeutic support, these things can be very effective for alcohol use disorder, and smoking, and the whole range of other things, trauma, PTSD. They're effective for that. So it's really interesting how in the last 20 years, basically about 20 years, the whole perception of psychedelics has changed, and now, well, now it's a different world. And now, even venture capitalists have gotten into it because they sense that, there's money to be made, and there is probably. But more importantly, there is also using these things for healing and therapy. And that's got to be a good thing, I mean, and besides that, in addition to that, I think that they are very useful for understanding consciousness. They're basically molecular probes to kind of push the envelope of consciousness, and see what is to be discovered within, as it were. I think in my book a few years ago, I said these molecules are like the chemical starships that let us navigate the universe within, because it is in there, and or in there, whatever that means, and these tools can be used that way as well. So it's still exciting.
Really is. It really is. Yeah, there's so much insight there to kind of go to. I mean, yeah, I do recall reading, is it William Wilson, whatever he went by, one of the
Wilson.
co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. Wasn't he part of
That's right.
one of the trials? And he had such a revelatory experience that he wanted to incorporate that into 12-step, but had a pushback from kind of the religious orthodoxy that had kind of
That's right.
cobbled together that model.
That's right. But his personal, his personal experience was very profound, and as you say, revelatory for him. He wanted to incorporate it into the therapy, but for exactly the reason, a lot of the 12-step protocols and all that sprang from a religious background. You had to acknowledge a higher power and all of that stuff, and so it didn't come to it in that case. And then the work that Humphrey Osmond did and other investigators did in Canada in the 60s with LSD and alcohol, they were getting tremendous results, and it was just dismissed. It was never paid attention to, and I look back now from the standpoint of this recent study last week. Now all of a sudden, it's going to get attention, and I think it's going to be approved very soon for those two things, at least, probably within the next year. But you have to look back and wonder how many people could have been helped. We could have done this 50 or 60 years ago. These therapies could have been available, but the craven politicians and the idiots were too busy suppressing it, and that's unfortunate. Many people have died because of this.
Yeah, many more have been criminalized as well. I mean,
criminalized. Yeah,
the reason I personally champion so hard for all drugs of all creeds is I've basically done most drugs. I've utilized drugs as a way to pacify personal trauma and a way to heal it. And I think that the denial of people of the autonomy to be able to, go on the hero's journey to, as sort of Jung described, to do the shadow work, or Nietzsche and staring into the abyss. Any of these kind of people you want to paraphrase or bring to the forefront now, all of them was, I think, speaking of the same thing, and that is our right in a lot of ways to look within, because as the Buddha says, there is infinitely more within than without. Everything without is an expression of the interpretation of the within anyway. And
that's right.
So yeah, it's an interesting point in our history where there's such a convergence of so many different theologies and groups of study, and the intersectionality of them as they all converge together. We're starting to see that, wait a minute, maybe religion was a way of kind of showcasing and holding the mystic and religious, the mystic and revelatory psychedelic experience in a way that you couldn't describe scientifically because there wasn't the means to do so. Or then the way that we see it sort of manifest in other ways now, entirely from pharmaceutical down, that they're going, wait a minute, we've studied everything else. The things we've said are bad to you guys for 50 years, we kind of figured that they're actually not now. So all these viewpoints are arriving at the same precipice where I feel we have an opportunity to liberate our consciousness. I agree. I do want to see these things accessible through a legalized system, but I worry that legalized means a new form of restricted, that it means, okay, you can go pay, and currently in the UK, for example, I'm not going to name the company for legal reasons. I think I have previously on the podcast, so I might get sued, whatever. They're charging $6,000 for 3 intravenous ketamine infusions in the UK. When people going into music festivals in the UK are then getting arrested and getting their lives ruined for having less than a gram on them. It's right. We're seeing this, the increased policing of them in the wild, as it were, and our unauthorized usage versus then going, oh, you can have this, but only if you have it in our space. And I worry that denies us frankly, sorry for the language, but tripping your balls off running around the woods thinking that the trees are gods. Do you know what I mean? We deserve to lose our sanity in a safe way, to experience ourselves beyond ourselves, to fragment ourselves, in my opinion, anyway.
No, I completely agree with you. I think that there's a place for medicalization of psychedelics, certain contexts, certain therapeutic goals, you can do in a clinical study, but I'm with you. I think that especially the natural psychedelics, the plant-derived, fungal-derived psychedelics should be lightly regulated or not regulated at all. I
Mhm.
think that one of the factors that's always poisoned the conversation about drugs since the 60s is the focus has been on the drugs, and the drugs themselves have been demonized.
Mm.
And, these are bad substances. I'm sorry. They're simply substances. They do what they do. There's no such thing as a bad drug. There are plenty of bad ways to use drugs, and
Mhm.
plenty positive ways to use drugs. And I think in the conversation, you've got to shift that focus, the moral focus from from the drugs. They are not demons, they are not pathogens, they're simply chemicals with certain pharmacologies. It's the moral dimension is the human dimension, and it's
Mm.
got to come from the choices people make about which drugs to use, how to use them, what's appropriate, and what's not. And this has never been the central focus of so-called drug education. Drug education is basically propaganda,
Mm.
because these things are not addressed in an honest way. But I mean, there's a place for drug education, real information that will give people choices about how to use these things, how to use them safely, how to, what to avoid, and so on. There needs to be more of that. But I am by inclination and belief, I think that I'm an advocate of symbiosis, and
Mm.
if you choose to use a plant or a fungus or anything for any purpose, doesn't have to be for psychoactive purposes. If you choose it for, anything, any plant or organism that's useful to us, that leads us to, say, cultivate it or care for it, that's a kind of symbiosis, an alliance between our species and other non-human species. This even predates the notion of indigenous use or ethnic use. I mean, those are traditions, but this really originates from biology.
Mhm.
This is where this is the level at which evolution works. We form collaborations and effectively symbiotic relationships for mutual benefits. So I
Mhm.
think we need to start talking about symbiosis as a basic right. People have a right to symbiosis, and not even a human right necessarily, because it goes beyond humanity. It's an organismic right in a certain way. People should be free to have a symbiosis with any organism that they wish to,
Mm.
provided it doesn't hurt other people. So
Mhm.
I think that we have to assert that this right to symbiose, using the word as a verb,
Mhm.
come together, let's symbiose together, and well, you and I can't symbiose with each other because we're the same species, right? So
Mhm.
then that would be something different. But you could go to the plants in your garden, or the mushrooms that you're growing or whatever, and if you've ever grown mushrooms or any plant really, that a lot of work goes into it. You have to care for those plants, you have to nurture them, and in turn they nurture us. So that's the best of symbiosis. And
Mm.
I would like to see a situation arise where uh these natural psychedelics are lightly regulated, and uh and they're made available to, not even regulated. I think that's
Provided
it's
with
really a
education.
education. Exactly, people are educated how to use them, and then there are places that they can go to use them, and they're not clinics. they're basically ceremonial centers, or they could even be like, under a broader umbrella, they could be like a wellness center of some kind. And where people could go and learn, where psychedelics are on the menu. It's an option, but people might go there for a weekend, or they'd be like spas, essentially, like health retreats where people can go and they can have that experience in a safe context, and with guidance, if they want, and but maybe learn some other things about mind body wellness practices, meditation, nutrition, all of those things, that might be offered at a holistic center. And I think there are many places, certainly in the States and probably in the UK and all over, and in Europe, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, where there are these centers. They are operating more or less underground, because the substances are prohibited. But if you could loosen those restrictions, then they could come out of the shadows and begin to offer these. And I think people would benefit greatly, these community oriented kind of wellness centers where, I think it's important that it be really integrated with the community. And it could be very good, a very good resource from the public health perspective, essentially, to help people, for an example, even with family therapy. I mean, people, you talk about giving kids psychedelics or teenagers psychedelics, and that's like, forbidden, that's a terrible idea, and so on. But this is just exactly the stage of life when young people are trying to sort it out, and they're trying to figure out their place in the world and what their orientation is. I have been to ayahuasca retreats in South America. I've organized ayahuasca retreats in South America, where people come, a family comes with their almost adult children, and maybe they're having some family issues and some, communication issues. Who doesn't these days? And I've just seen tremendously helpful things go on in terms of the family relationship. They come arguing and fighting, and they leave loving. So, can't really argue with that.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I think the symbiosis as an argument, I think is brilliant. As any of my audience are quite aware, I'm a stickler for language. For all I have no formal education to speak of, I've ended up as a writer and quite a prolific reader, and always tried to get down into the nuance of the language. And the way you described the drugs themselves as being, well, they are neutral, they are benign objects. It is until human action gives them intention. And it's interesting that no single drug on the planet is illegal. It is human action with them. That cannabis plant, that bag of cocaine, it isn't going to get arrested. It's not going to be put in handcuffs, taken to a courtroom and tried. And it doesn't have an identity. It doesn't have an ability to go through that system. And I think, removing almost the drugs from the conversation, because as I've seen you speak of personally, that we are made of drugs. That if you look at it, the stimuli from the external world triggers within us mechanisms of neurological, chemical, and hormonal production, which are the reason they are triggered by things like opioids, things like cannabinoids, things like, psilocin and DMT, is that these things, networks, are within us. So it again, the absence of this is one of the things I've been trying to do with my work, to show that the blip of prohibition, let's call it effectively just the century, what we should call in the West the century of shame, our century of shame, the true prohibition of all of these compounds and substances, I think has detrimentally affected the cultural inflection, its perceptions. I mean, we've had a complete drop-off of religiosity, for all I disagree with monotheistic religions and kind of dogma that ascribes, with a whip and a fear of hell or whatever. I'm much more open to conversations that change. And so I agree that keeping this in a sanitized clinical setting will only further that. whereas then allowing that symbiosis of within the species, this comes in the form of music festivals, in Friday nights at beaches when, we have barbecues and drinks and all these other rituals and modern ceremonies. We don't need necessarily to go back centuries to look at the history of rituals to, we can recognize the ones we have. I mean, I speak often with glee and with nostalgia of my youth, of being 13, 14, and about 5 of us having to get the stuff together to roll a joint. Someone to go off and get a cigarette, someone in the shop to get cigarettes. We get roached because in Europeans we put a crutch in it. We'd have to go get the papers. Someone would have to go and get we called it tack, the really horrible hard hash. You get a lighter, you'd have to have 3 years windproofing it. And the whole ritual, the ceremony of it was almost as bonding as the experience of them being high and talking shit. It was the same with like when you go mushroom picking with those people, the conversations and the mind space. I mean, one of the things I wanted to speak to you about actually is again, language within this. We're seeing sort of 2 different groups, as it were, using 2 different ways of describing the same thing. So academics have now typically fallen into the language of entheogenic substances over psychedelic, and we've moved more towards cessation or pausing of a default mode network rather than ego death. And I was just wanted to get your opinions on, well, someone that I can quite comfortably call a psychonaut and an academic that studies this, as to what you think sort of is the correct nomenclature here, in the way that we can, I believe, through standardization of language, all point at the same thing and talk about it. Whereas I feel for a long time, like you said, our different perspectives have meant that we've not necessarily all been talking about the same thing in front of us.
Well, yeah, I mean that the terminology has changed. Now they talk about the default mode network, and that's one way to look at it. I used to, and I guess I still do. Like the default mode network is what I sometimes call the reality hallucination. In the sense that, as I've said many times, we create a model of reality. That's what our neurochemical. That's what our sensory filters are. The default mode network is a it is a mechanism that takes in information from the external world through the senses. A lot of what it does is exclude information, so there are neural gating pathways that many things don't get through. If everything got through, it would just be a blooming, buzzing confusion. What the default mode network is, the brain's evolutionarily developed a capacity for kind of constructing this model of reality, which makes sense. And that lets us navigate through reality. And it's very useful. It's what we call the ordinary state of consciousness, that lets us go from day to day and do the things we need to do, whether it's crossing the street or, opening a can of tuna fish or, using your computer, all those things that render us capable, that we're capable of doing because we can focus on it and doing it. Psychedelics temporarily disrupt that. They temporarily and deliberately disable the default mode network. Effectively, they are giving you an opportunity to step outside that reference frame, that you inhabit. And I think that is really where the therapeutic efficacy of a lot of psychedelics, of the psychedelics as a class, that's where it lies. It lets you look at things from a different perspective. And in some ways, think about, for example, your relationship with alcohol, if you have problems, or your relationship with tobacco, or your relationship with death, and your fear of death, or, your anxiety, your trauma, your traumatic experiences, and so on. All of these things we tend to internalize, and they become part of our default mode network, the way we operate. If you introduce psychedelics as a catalyst that effectively blows that up, just disables it, disrupts it temporarily, it's going to fall back together, as you get over the drug. It's going to fall back together, but it will often fall back together in a more functional way. I really think that there is a lot of similarities to rebooting your computer. I mean, I'm not sure how far that analogy goes, but I think it goes pretty far. How when you reboot, when your computer's getting mucked up and things are not working, you restart, and that like purges the system of all this kludge that's built up. I think the psychedelics are like that. They're a big neurochemical, particularly serotonin reset, and when you have a profound psychedelic experience, a high dose psychedelic experience, this is what happens. You temporarily demolish, you don't demolish it, you disable it. But then the neurochemistry, our bodies, our brains tend toward equilibrium, and they tend toward this equilibrium state. That's what keeps them going. But when you have one of these experiences, then it all comes back together, slowly, piece by piece, but it works better. It's kind of like you've gone in and scrubbed it, or you've lubricated it, or whatever analogy you want to apply. But I think that's why, if you look at these different therapeutic areas, like, and you say psilocybin, how can it be? It's like a panacea. How can it be good for all of these things? Trauma, anxiety, substance abuse, all of the things that we're now identifying that it's good for. Well, it's because they have this similar mechanism, this ability to step outside your reference frame temporarily. This is why I'm a big skeptic. There are a number of people now trying to develop psychedelics that aren't psychedelics. You may have heard of this. There's
the trip without the trip.
The trip without the trip. I think they're wasting their time, frankly.
The trip is the heal.
The trip is the heal. The trip is the heal. It's not going to work. This is what they've been trying to do for years. It's like they've learned nothing from the whole history of previous psychopharmacology, the development of psychopharmaceuticals like SSRIs, which basically don't do anything. They're not much better than placebos. So it's like, when are they? And this gets to some important, I think, insights about the mindset of the what you might call the biomedical psychopharmaceutical industrial complex, which is, they don't want to admit the spirit into medicine. They want to make medicine has tried for at least 150 years to exorcise spirit out of medicine. We're just complex machines, and if we apply the right monkey wrench, we can fix the machine and it'll all be good. I'm sorry, we're not machines. It doesn't work that way. And so psychedelics in this era of medicine have forced medicine to acknowledge there is a spiritual aspect to healing, and the people working on psychedelics, they don't want to admit that. They don't want, so there's got to be a way around that. They're back to the idea, if we can just tweak this receptor system here, upregulate those transporters, do this like internal mechanistic reorganization, people will get over their trauma, their addiction, or whatever, and they won't ever have to actually confront it on a personal experiential level. It'll just be fixed. They're wasting their time, and actually unfortunately they're wasting millions, if not billions of dollars on this. It's a dry run. It's a dead hole, a dead end, I believe. You have to have the trip.
Yeah, 100% agree. 100% agree. I mean, It's what is it? Effectively Descartesian philosophy. It was Descartes, René Descartes, I believe, who basically came with the mechanistic human concept, and obviously that somehow has ended up tied with what became eugenics, social Darwinism, and all of these other frankly fucked up conceptual ideas through the 18 and 19th century, 1800s and 1900s. At the same time, when there was this rapid medicinalization, we had the creation of the hypodermic needle, we had suddenly the smoking of opium and all of the moral ills to, oh, well, we've just bio-created heroin, you know, these guys created morphine and we're going to inject it into you. And again, we completely lost, and anything that was mentioned of the psychoactive experience of opioids completely dismissed. And it's like anyone that has taken opioids at a certain level, your brain starts to get a wee bit fucked up. It starts to go to different places. It's the same as kind of like sleep deprivation over a long period of time. It starts to check out, starts to fill in gaps. You get really, a bit wobbly with it. And so again, it started almost as a consequence of that, the silencing of that. Does it knock them out? Yeah. Then anything else don't care about. We don't care about.
Right.
I mean, they say like anesthesiologists are the only people in the world that know how the brain works because they can turn the fucker off. And I think that's true of
That's
science.
quite true. That's right.
And so we've built all of this predication on that drugs are bad. Why? Because we say they're bad. Why do you say they're bad? Because they're bad. And they're in this loop of fallibility, just keep going back over a century. And as you say, they're very much repeating the same mistakes. The consumption of opium when it was smoked was quite benign. When it was mixed with hashish, was actually considered quite medicinal by multiple cultures for countless centuries across the face of the earth. And so,
it was, in fact, it was therapeutic. I think it's
it arguably still is now. It's just that it's demonized in terms of that you see somebody on the street using it and be injecting and going, oh my God, it's like, well, they're healing. They're trying to pacify a pain, a trauma. They're just getting through life.
Right. Often better to rely on the not refined, the refined narcotics, the refined drugs are much more dangerous, much more prone to abuse, obviously inherently more toxic and all that. But I think you touched on a important point, which this goes back to what we were talking about the exercising of spirit out of medicine. It started a while ago, but back in the day when it was the precursor of medicine, and when people were mucking around with plants and doing distillations and this sort of thing, the idea there was that there were spirits in these plants, and it goes back in the history of alchemy. We talk about distilled spirits. That goes back into an era where it was thinking you could actually extract the spirits and concentrate the spirits, in the medicine. And that was the perception. And then along came this pharmacist, this Swiss pharmacist, Sertiner, who isolated morphine in a pure form from opium for the first time. Morphine alkaloid was isolated by him, and I think it was 1803 or something. And you could crystallize it, and it clearly was not alive, right? It was not a spirit. It was not even alive. It was a crystal, but it had much the same effect as opium. So then that led to a perception that it all just comes down to chemistry. There's no life force in these plants. There's just chemicals, and if you isolate the chemical, then you can precisely measure the dose, and you don't need the living source anymore. You can just do chemistry. So that led to sort of this detour of medicine into what you might call pharmacotherapy, the idea that this idea of the right molecule applied to the right place will bring about the therapeutic effect. And the spiritual aspect, as you mentioned, the mind-body connection was just brushed aside, and it impoverished medicine in a certain way. It took these tools out of the hands of, for example, priests, shamans, and that sort of thing, who incorporated their use in a in a spiritual aspect, and it hands it over to clinicians, and something was lost in that transition. Of course, that said, we must also point out that organized religions have been complicit in this. The suppression of essentially what I call biological aspects of human existence. Catholicism, the Christian religions are all go to great lengths to deny that. The last thing they want people to have is an actual mystical experience. That's why psychedelics are so threatening to religious dogmatists, because the dogma is, that's what the priests are. The priests have the right to do that. We'll tell you what it was about. We'll have the experiences and then tell you what you're supposed to think. This is my beef with religion. Religion is basically, a set of principles, a set of dogma to say, these are the answers, and you're supposed to accept those on faith, and don't ask so many pesky questions. And if anything, psychedelics make you, they're an antidote to that. They make you ask all kinds of questions, and this is what they're for. But they are threatening to the powers that be that don't want you to ask any questions. My brother used to say the reason psychedelics are dangerous is not because they're toxic or anything on that level. They're dangerous because they make you have funny ideas, and funny ideas are inherently dangerous.
Interesting. Yeah, perfect way of encapsulating. I mean, we learned from sort of the John Ehrlichman quote, the Nixon advisor, when he obviously started the modern war on drugs, and they talk about the reasoning as to why they started it, and the association of cannabis and heroin to certain populations, and being able to demonize their movements, criminalize their leadership, break up their meetings. I think that the same has been an extension for the entirety of the war on drugs, is that if you suddenly get a bunch of people in random roles, whatever position or station they are in the world, and you take 5 of them to the woods to have 3 or 4 grams each around a fire, they are 4 or 5 animals in the woods. The processing, and I don't mean that in a vicious or violent or thuggish way. I mean in the rawest sense. They are truly human. There is something that has perplexed me my entire life, is that we speak of the human experience absent and abstract of nature, when we are entirely of nature. I mean, there's a modern argument in biology that effectively you are not you. There is more foreign bacteria than bacteria that's you in your body, ergo you isn't you. That's kind of the argument of, I can't remember the name of the ship, but if you replace all parts. So there is this conceptual thing that if you're not then your body, you are your consciousness. And you say we've completely suppressed consciousness for centuries and kind of just gone, I am it. That is what I am. And it's not until you have meditation or a religious experience, and again, I believe most religious experiences kind of rob from cultural aspects, chanting, singing in dimensioned rooms where you're channeling energy, all of these other things that then leads to a controlled experience that then one man, the conductor of the orchestra at the front, can go, that's God. That's our God you've just experienced. All that joy, all that love, all that niceness, and it indoctrinates them. And this is what I fear for these new clinics and these new spaces. For all I agree that it's based on the principles of, I can't remember the name of the couple that did it in California when it was the love drug, and it was a male and female therapist, and they did it in an environment and in a way that tried to offset what can be, how do I describe this, kind of natural urges, inclinations. When one takes certain compounds and substances, you become more human, less sort of resolved to traditional paradigms and all the rest of it. But it then allows a neutralizing of that, not in a negative way, as to say deny it, but in a way that controls it safely. Do you know what I mean? And I think that what we're seeing in the modern sense, I think is too narrowing. It's not going to include what the experience is. It's too driven to the outcome they want. Does that make sense?
Yes, it totally makes sense. I mean, you have to develop the clinical protocols right now, in part to get these things approved. But I think that once they are approved, I'm much more in favor of a more ceremonial setting. I think that clinical psychedelic therapy needs to borrow from traditional psychedelic therapy, and that's indigenous indigenous use of these things. I don't think we can ape it. I don't think we can mimic it, but we can learn from it and borrow from it. There needs to be a ritual context. I sometimes tell people ayahuasca is a liquid. It will fill whatever vessel you create for it, but you have to have a vessel. You can't pour it out into your hands. You have to create a vessel. And that may be a traditional curanderismo kind of vessel, or it may be a neo-shamanic kind of vessel, or some context that you create to let the experience happen in a safe environment, with thoughtfully, respectfully, with preparation, allow it to happen, allow an opportunity to integrate and reflect on the experience and so on. This can all be done very easily and most easily probably in a group setting and in a ceremonial space, and that is not so clinical. And I think that's what's going to evolve. Indigenous people have been using psychedelics for, God knows how long, probably tens of thousands of years. They have learned a few things about how to use these substances, and so you have to acknowledge that and borrow what they've learned and understand that, the as Leary and all the other old people in this realm have said for years, it's set and setting that is the important thing. And I would say there are 4 variables that are most important. The set is your mindset. This is probably the most important thing, what you bring to the table, your expectations, your intentions, but also really everything you are, everything you've ever learned. That's the set. You're the participant. The setting is the setting, where you do it. Most importantly, it has to be in a place where it's safe, it's safe, you're not under threat, and you don't have to pay attention to the minutia, who's going to phone, who's going to come in the door, whatever. You got to create a situation where you're free to focus on what is happening in the thing. So it needs to be an appropriate setting, and that's different for different people. Like some people, that's in their bedroom in total darkness, other people that's out in the woods. Either one of those is fine, and everything in between, as long as you've thought carefully about the set and setting. And the other 2 variables that are sometimes overlooked, but very important, is the medicine, what is it? And then the dose, and both these 2 things, these variables also profoundly affect the outcome. So setting, what the medicine is, what the dose is, all of those things need to be carefully thought about and planned around. The important thing, those are the important things for a good outcome, I think, of these experiences. Anyway.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's very good to expand upon that, because again, everyone thinks of set and setting because, again, it's the same as the turn on, tune in, drop out. It became sort of the catchphrases, the sound bites of the generations that sort of, definitely preceded myself, and obviously generations yourself are sort of later involved with. It's interesting that we spoke of before of the inability of these new novel compounds that they're creating to kind of work in the way that they want them to. Obviously, it feels the intention of creating novel patented synthetics or stereoisomers, sort of mirrored compounds of them, is a way to then obviously create a patent on it. My inclination is towards potentially from their side, not necessarily our best interest at heart. They obviously want to heal trauma, in my opinion, as a way to get the workers back as a way to get the soldiers back on the field, as a way to pacify the symptoms that arise as a consequence of the socio-economic problems that, in my opinion, arise from neoliberalistic ideology running capitalism. So we're now seeing, obviously, LSD was tune on, I can't even say it, tune in, turn on, drop out, has then gone to Silicon Valley going, oh yes, our executives can microdose it because it increases productivity by 20%. We're seeing kind of a co-option by the matrix, the system in which we operate, of our rebellion. So they saw the 60s and kind of went, shit, right, what were the consequences? What happened when they had LSD and MDMA and all these other different things kicking around? All right, cease that, get rid of that, deal with the consequence. And I think it took until Reaganomics in America and Thatcherism in the UK and the real uptake of this neoliberalism of deregulation, of quite egoism, selfishness, and what destroys ego and this idea, this false facade, this guise that we believe that we are, more than a high dose of a psychedelic compound. And so I think they became ever more threatening. And yet there was a subculture of individuals, like you said, from people of like James Federman's generation, that never stopped the therapies. They just never stopped. FDA and everybody, DEA, everybody was like, nah, you're not doing it. And they went, all right, we'll just not advertise it. And they just kept going. They've built this literature and they've built all of this knowledge base, but I don't feel that that is being used in conjunction with the development of these synthetics. We can see this in the intentions of what happened with cannabinoids. So obviously Pfizer are responsible for the creation of what we call in the UK and in Europe, strain is the wrong term. Actually, no, strain because it's a chemical composition of a synthetic cannabinoid called K2. That was started by Pfizer. That was created in the laboratories in like the 70s. Obviously, they synthesized decades before, but this formulation has then become a very popular street drug. This was created in experimentation, not because they wanted to study natural phytocannabinoids or endocannabinoids in the human system, but could they create something in isolate that was profitable, patented, intellectually property protected? And we're seeing that now, and I worry that same intention, that same investment train that has crashed cannabis, because that, frankly, the people that have had regulators from around the world that are talking about this, we've got some people from Germany coming up soon as well, and they're saying the same thing, is that legalization is not the answer to this. Legalization, in my terminology that I'm sort of crudely working out at the minute, I feel is the end point, the last death crow of prohibition. That it is the last attempt of the system to go, oh, you can have the things, but you can only have this one and here, and they're desperately holding it. And we're so close to getting them all back. And the thing is, the revolution and the revelations that the cultures, communities are going to have, we're going to achieve far more in a few years and decades of having natural organic access, and I mean that in all senses, to these compounds, than decades of this ESG inspired kind of corporate wokeness and the evolution towards these, again, non-organic artificial structures, futures that they're driving us towards. So I think that we're at a point where we need that renaissance, not in necessarily just in research, but in it being taken in the wild. Do you know what I mean? We need the people to just get on it, and you spread the information that we have, spread setting, compound and dose, and trips at each other, learn these things. You can now go and get degrees online. There are different organizations you can go to. As you said, there are retreats, there are more and more space than ever for us to explore these things. Obviously they're still highly criminalized, but done in the right way, they're not even thinking about DMT or something like that. You know what I mean?
No, they should just forget trying to regulate these things, especially in the natural form, right? I mean, this is how you can fight back against, what you're seeing. This is capitalism. This is the way capitalism works. They want to patent these things and protect them and then restrict access. But it's very hard to restrict access to plants, and fungi. So you fight back that way, in a sense, with the natural psychedelics. You do what plant people have always done. You trade them across the back fence. You plant gardens, you propagate the knowledge, you teach people how to grow them, create these centers where they can be used. make it much more organic, and you can ally through the permaculture movement and things like that. I think it's a much more organic, much more co-evolutionary, if you will, approach to the use of these things. I don't worry too much about the medicalization of psychedelics. I think it's a phase, I think there will be some good therapies that come out of it, and those will be available to those that can afford it. But I think for most people, they'd even prefer to seek out the natural therapies, the natural substances, and we should create a situation where that's possible. Where these things are not prohibited. You can, they're regulated only to the extent that there's quality control, not particularly about how they're used or who can use them and so on. So we live in an interesting time, and I sometimes I find comfort sometimes in the idea that what we're witnessing here is a co-evolutionary process. It's the same process that's played out ever since we started mucking with these plants, and God knows how long ago that was, So that process, evolution, the way biology works, it works on timescales that are much, much longer than our civilization, than our history. We were using these plants before there was even history. We'll probably be using them after history ends, unless of course everything ends. But that's another conversation. So I think this is kind of a good place to end. I don't know how long you want to go, but
if I ask you a couple more, if I could keep you just a little bit longer, if that's all right.
Sure.
Well, I think I'm gonna have to invite you back on as well in terms of there's a lot of questions here, so I'll just pick I'll pick a couple. I suppose intersection, right? Actually, here's one that I just wanted to ask you. This was just my personal sort of question. I have personally consumed an incredible amount of psychedelic compounds in different guises, different ways over my time. The one that I just can't seem to get any grip on at all or understanding is salvia. What is going on with the pharmacology and the way it interacts with the human psyche with salvia?
Well, salvia is a tricky one. I haven't had that much experience with it because it is very hard to relate to the state of mind. It's not a psychedelic in the strict sense of a psychedelic. A psychedelic in the pharmacological sense, I define them as compounds that interact with the serotonin 2A receptors, right? And that subset of about 14 different kinds of serotonin receptors, all of the true psychedelics, LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, the classic, what used to be called the classic hallucinogens, the classic psychedelics, are all these serotonin 2A agonists. Salvia doesn't hit any of those receptors. Salvinorin A is actually a kappa opiate agonist. There are three kinds of opiate receptors: the mu, delta, and kappa receptors. Salvia targets the kappa receptor and no other receptors, as far as anyone knows. The binding profile of salvinorin A is quite remarkable. It's the most potent psychoactive substance from nature that's known. It's active at around the 50 microgram level, and it hits only the kappa opiate receptor, which is remarkable for any drug. Most drugs are, they're not that selective. They hit, like LSD, for example, hits a number of serotonin receptors, not just one, or even other receptors like dopamine. That's the usual case for drugs. They're dirty drugs, they're not that selective. Salvinorin A is like it was engineered to hit only this one receptor. And the states of mind that it elicits are just quite bizarre, very hard to deal with because they're so alien. But at least we understand the pharmacology of it now. What you do with that state, I'm not sure. There are people working on salvin derivatives that may be useful for anxiety and depression. But it is a new area of psychopharmacology for sure.
Yeah. As you said, I think alien is the only way to describe it. It's one of those ones that I kind of build to a curiosity of it. Anytime I'd kind of go with any sort of Changa mixes or blends or a synthetic DMT sort of experience, it would always be with an excitement. Whereas Salvia would always be a kind of, there's something here, because I'd always feel the days and weeks after an experience positive uptick. I can't describe necessarily how, but life was just easier to deal with. Yet the more I then try to conceptualize it, at least with sort of DMT experiences, I have almost a memory, kind of like an echo within myself when I think of the experience, something I could feel. Whereas again, thinking back to a Salvia sort of a trip or experience, it's just so, I don't know, it's shapes and numbers. I could describe colors and shapes in such an abstract way that it's not how your mind processes things. So yeah, it was just in the way that I consider it more of a dissociative, but in such a way that I don't know, that I feel there's something there, I guess, and maybe that's just me being a bit masochistic and a bit like, go on then. I don't
know. I mean, I think there is something there, but what it is, what you do with it. I mean, for many people it's dysphoric, for many people it's not pleasant at all. It's mercifully short, and some people like it and some people feel they get something out of it. I was never one of those people. I could not relate to what it was. I mean, it was just put a data point down in this, completely alien landscape of the Salvia experience, but worth exploring, for people that can get into it. Maybe there's a use to it. I mean, it's used traditionally. The leaves are chewed. The Mazatec use it as a salvia, as a substitute for mushrooms sometimes, or they also use it in its own right. And when you chew it, when you chew the leaves, it has a much longer pharmacokinetics, and it's not quite so strange, but it's still plenty strange. But in the chewed form, it's kind of a different thing. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, yeah, thank you for satisfying my own morbid curiosity around such a substance. Yeah, like I said, it is kind of one of the only ones in my brain that I keep as it's just, so abstract and alien. I'd like to obviously maybe invite you on again in the future, because I think there is so much more of a conversation that we can have around different topics here. But for now, I just want to thank you very much for making the time today.
Okay. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Yeah, we can circle back. We can do this again, and let me know when you've got it posted. I have through the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. I'll plug that. It's just McKenna.academy. Look at the website and then look at these two ESPD sites, and I think your listeners will find a lot of rich material there. And the McKenna.academy, I mean, it's McKenna.academy. That's the suffix for it. And check out the website, and you can see what we're up to, which is quite a lot, actually. Yeah. So thank you very much, and we'll talk another day.
Brilliant. Well, I'll leave you to your day and to my evening. I'll let you go. I'll do housekeeping. So once again, brilliant to meet you, Dennis, and thank you for your time.
A real pleasure.
Right.
Thank you.
Peace.
Thank
Cheers,
you.
brother.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Well, there you go, folks. That was episode 93, featuring the one and only, the legendary Dennis McKenna. I hope you enjoyed that half as much as I did. I know they don't meet heroes, but that's bullshit. That was wicked. Glad we got the extra bit of time at the end. Really grateful for him just making the time in general. Really enjoyed that conversation. If you guys did as well, please do give us a like, share, and a subscribe. Every little helps. Click down there, the little red button. Just go click it, click it, click it. I'll wait, click it. Thank you. All right. Yeah, check us out on all social media platforms at The Simpa Life. We'll be back next week with a guest, and it'll be awesome, and you'll enjoy it. It'll be cool. All right. Peace, love, folks. Bullshit. Just finished the recording.